The call came at 12:47 in the afternoon, on the fourth Thursday of November, and I know the exact time because I looked at my phone when it rang, and I had been arguing with myself for 3 days about whether to answer calls from unknown numbers at the dinner table in front of my parents, and the argument resolved itself the moment I saw that the area code was not a local one and that the caller ID read Internal Revenue Service. You do not let an IRS call go to voicemail at Thanksgiving dinner. You do not let an IRS call go to voicemail at any dinner. You push your chair back and you excuse yourself and you take it. I took it in the hallway outside the dining room of my parents' house on Fieldstone Court in Alpharetta, Georgia. Standing between the closet where my mother keeps her seasonal decorations and the framed school photographs of my brother, Devin and me, that have been on that wall since the late 1990s and that she has never replaced with the adult versions, which I have always thought was a choice rather than an oversight. The IRS agent identified herself by name and employee number. She said she was calling in regard to the estate of Constance Loretta Freeman, which was my grandmother's full name. She said there were discrepancies in the estate tax filings that had been submitted on behalf of the estate by a representative named Devin Alexander Freeman, and that she needed to speak with whoever held executor authority over the estate. I told her I was the executor. I had to say it standing in the hallway, between the seasonal decorations and my third-grade school photograph, with my mother's good china on the table 12 feet away, and a turkey my mother had brined overnight in a bag of diamond crystal kosher salt available at Kroger for about $9 for the 3-pound box cooling on the counter. Because my brother Devin had not told anyone he had filed anything on behalf of my grandmother's estate, and because the person who held executor authority over that estate was me, and because the distance between those two facts is the entire story I am about to tell you. My name is Paulette Freeman OC. I am 41 years old. I work as a compliance officer at a financial services firm called Meridian Capital Group on Peachtree Road in Buckhead, Atlanta, where I have been employed for 8 years. My work is the enforcement of financial regulation, the monitoring of accounts, the documentation of transactions, the identification of patterns that do not match what they should. I do this work with the precision that it requires, and with the professional understanding that the gap between what financial records say and what they mean is almost always where the important information lives. I did not apply this precision to my own family's finances for the 3 years between my grandmother's death and the Thanksgiving phone call. I have thought about that failure many times since, and I have understood it. And I want to explain it clearly because I think it is useful. I did not apply my professional vigilance to my family's finances because families are the specific zone where professional vigilance feels like an accusation. And I was not yet ready to make that accusation. And my brother Devin had spent 3 years making sure I was not ready. Constance Loretta Freeman was my maternal grandmother. She was born in 1938 in Macon, Georgia, and she lived for the last 22 years of her life in a house on Briarcliff Road in Decatur that she had owned since 1979. She died at 81 in November, 3 years before the Thanksgiving phone call, of complications following hip replacement surgery at Emory University Hospital on Clifton Road in Atlanta. She was sharp until the end. She did the Atlanta Journal-Constitution crossword puzzle every morning in pen, which she considered the only honest way to do a crossword. And she had strong opinions about the Oxford comma and about the eighth proper pre-eighth, the preparation of cornbread, no sugar, cast iron skillet, preheated in the oven, not the stovetop, and she communicated these opinions freely and without apology to anyone in range. I loved her with the specific completeness. You love someone who has always told you exactly what she thought of you, which in my case was that I was the most organized person she had ever known and that I had a gift for seeing the thing other people were pretending not to see. She wrote her will with an attorney named Carolyn Bassett at a firm called Bassett and Horn on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Decatur. She wrote it in 2014 when she was 76 and her hip was beginning to cause the trouble it would eventually cause fatally. The will named me as executor. It named my mother, Patricia Freeman, and my uncle, Roderick Freeman, as the primary beneficiaries of the estate, divided equally between them. Devin was named as a specific beneficiary for the contents of her china cabinet and her 1994 Buick LeSabre, which she had given him because he had admired it since he was 16, and because my grandmother had a gift for giving people the exact thing they had shown her they wanted, which is one of the forms of love that does not get named often enough. Devin is 37. He lives on Holcomb Bridge Road in Roswell, Georgia, in an apartment he has rented for 4 years. He has worked across a decade since he graduated from Georgia State University on Piedmont Avenue in Atlanta with a degree in communications, in a sequence of roles in marketing, advertising, and most recently, digital content, none of which he has held for longer than 2 years, and most of which have ended in circumstances described to the family in terms that position Devin as the person who had been treated unfairly by circumstances he did not control, which is a narrative our parents received with the consistent generosity of people who have decided that their sons' difficulties are the world's fault. I am not unsympathetic to my brother. He is bright and he is capable, and he has a warmth that people respond to immediately, and a difficulty with sustained effort that he has been managing without adequate tools for most of his adult life. I say this not to excuse what he did, but to establish that what he did not come from nowhere. It came from a pattern, and the pattern had a long history that my parents had chosen not to address. And the choosing not to address it is the second subject of this account. My grandmother died on a November Saturday, and I flew to Atlanta from a work conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, the following morning. I arrived at the house on Briarcliff Road in Decatur to find my mother, my uncle, Roderick, and Devin already there. Devin had driven from Roswell. He had, by his account, arrived the previous evening, before our grandmother died, because he had a key. A key my grandmother had given him 3 years earlier when he had needed a place to stay for a month after losing a job in an apartment in the same week, which my grandmother had provided without asking him to explain himself, which was characteristic of her. He had been in the house for 12 hours before I arrived. I noted this and said nothing, because noting it and saying nothing was the calculation I had been making about Devin for most of my adult life, and the habit of it was by then very well established. In the weeks that followed, I administered the estate with the methodical attention I bring to everything that requires methodical attention. I retained Carolyn Bassett at Bassett and Horn to guide the probate process through DeKalb County Probate Court on Commerce Drive in Decatur. I inventoried the house on Briarcliff Road, which Constance Freeman had kept with the order and specificity of a woman who had always known exactly what she owned and where she kept it, her financial documents, and a metal Century 1170 fire-resistant file cabinet in her bedroom closet, her ear-ins, policies, and a manila accordion folder labeled in her handwriting, her bank statements in chronological order, in a box labeled Finances, going back to 2009. I took custody of the file cabinet and the folder and the box. I opened the estate account at Regions Bank on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Decatur, as Carolyn Bassett advised, for the receipt and disbursement of estate funds. What I did not do in those first weeks of estate administration was verify the balances in my grandmother's personal accounts against the statements I had in hand. I had the statements. I had reviewed them sufficiently to complete the estate. Inventory: I listed 2 checking accounts and 1 savings account at Citizens Trust Bank on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and 1 money market account at Edward Jones through a broker named Gerald Hinton at the Marietta Street office, and a certificate of deposit at the same institution. The total value of the liquid assets I inventoried was consistent with what I expected, based on what my grandmother had told me about her finances in the years before her death. I did not pull the real-time balances from the institutions themselves. I relied on the most recent statements in the file cabinet, which were dated from the prior month. The most recent statements were not the most recent statements. I understand now that they were not. The statements in my grandmother's file cabinet for October of the year she died were not the October statements that Citizens Trust Bank and Edward Jones had generated. They were October statements from a prior year, substituted into the folders with sufficient care that a person reviewing them for inventory purposes, a person who trusted the organizational system of the woman who had kept those files, would not immediately identify the substitution. The account numbers were correct, the institution names were correct, the dates were wrong, and I did not look at the dates with the scrutiny I would have applied to a client file at Meridian Capital Group, because this was my grandmother's file cabinet, and I was grieving, and because Devin had been in the house for 12 hours before I arrived. I am telling you this because it is important to name the mechanism exactly. The substitution of prior year statements for current year statements in a deceased person's file cabinet is a specific act requiring access, time, and the deliberate intention to misdirect the executor's inventory. It is not an error. It is not a misunderstanding. It is the preparation of a concealment, and it was prepared in the 12 hours between Devin's arrival at the house on Briarcliff Road and mine. The IRS agent in the hallway on Thanksgiving, whose name was Special Agent Denise Kwan of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, CI, as it is known in the field, the law enforcement arm of the IRS that investigates tax crimes, not merely audits, told me the following in the 11 minutes I stood in that hallway. She told me that a federal estate tax return had been filed on behalf of the estate of Constance Loretta Freeman by a representative identified as Devin Alexander Freeman, listing himself as the estate's authorized representative. She told me that the return had reported total estate assets that were approximately $212,000 below the figures that the financial institutions holding my grandmother's accounts had separately reported to the IRS under their standard reporting requirements. She told me that the discrepancy between what the institutions had reported and what Devon had filed indicated that funds had been withdrawn from the estate accounts prior to the filing of the estate tax return and had not been reported as estate assets. She told me that the withdrawals, based on the records she was authorized to share with an executor, totaled approximately $212,000 and had occurred across a 14-month window beginning 11 days after my grandmother's death. 11 days. I had arrived at the house on Briarcliff Road in Decatur the morning after my grandmother died. Devin had been there 12 hours before me. He had been in the house for 12 hours, and then I had been there for the duration of the estate administration, for the inventory, for the probate filings, for the distribution of the specific bequests, for the transfer of the Buick LeSabre into Devin's name. I had been present throughout, administering the estate with the methodical care I bring to everything, and Devin had been 14 months withdrawing $212,000 from accounts whose current statements I had never pulled because I had trusted the file cabinet of a woman whose organizational habits I had relied on for 40 years without verification. Special Agent Kwan asked me if I wanted to come into the IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office on Spring Street in Atlanta to make a formal statement. I told her I would be there Monday morning. I told her I needed the weekend to retain an attorney. I went back to the dining room. My mother was serving the sweet potato casserole. Devin was at the table. He looked at me when I sat down, and he held my gaze for 3 seconds in the specific way he has held my gaze when he knows I know something, which is a look he has given me since childhood, since the time he broke a window with a baseball, and our mother asked if we knew what had happened, and he looked at me across the kitchen with that same expression, which is not defiance and not guilt, but the look of someone calculating the distance between where they are and where the consequences are. I picked up my fork. I ate the sweet potato casserole, which my mother makes with Kraft miniature marshmallows on top and which I have always found too sweet and which I ate that afternoon without tasting. I ate the turkey and the green beans and the cornbread, which my mother makes incorrectly in my grandmother's opinion because she adds 2 teaspoons of sugar to the batter, which was a disagreement my grandmother prosecuted gently every Thanksgiving for 20 years. I ate everything on my plate, and I helped my mother clear the table, and I helped with the dishes, and I drove home to my apartment on La Vista Road in Tucker, Georgia, and I called my attorney from the car. My attorney was a woman named Rachel Fortier at a firm called Fortier Law on Peachtree Battle Avenue in Atlanta, who specializes in probate litigation and whom Carolyn Bassett at Bassett and Horn had referred me to 18 months earlier when a dispute arose in an unrelated estate matter I was handling for a colleague. I had Rachel Fortier's cell number in my phone for exactly the reason Rachel Fortier gives her cell number to clients. Because some things cannot wait until Monday morning. This was not a thing that could wait until Monday morning. She answered on the third ring. I told her what Special Agent Kwon had told me. There is a silence on the line that I have come to recognize as the silence of an attorney reorganizing what she thought she knew into what she has just been told. Then she said, Who else knows you got that call today? I told her only me. At that point, she said good. She said I should not discuss the call with my parents or with Devin before we spoke Monday morning in person, and that she would call Special Agent Kwan first thing Monday to establish the parameters of my cooperation as executor. She said she needed me to pull the real-time account statements from Citizens Trust Bank and Edward Jones first thing in the morning, not the statements from the file cabinet, but the current statements directly from the institutions showing every transaction since my grandmother's death. She said I had executor authority and both institutions were required to produce them. I told her I had executor authority documented and that I knew exactly who to call at both institutions. She said, I know you do. I'll see you Monday. I pulled the statement Saturday morning. Citizens Trust Bank on Auburn Avenue has a dedicated estate services line, 404-659-5959, and I reached the estate services officer, a man named Mr. Terrell Avery, at 9:15. He verified my executor documentation by fax. I faxed from the eFax account I maintain for exactly this kind of document transmission, available at efax.com, for about $17 per month, and he sent me the full transaction history on both checking accounts within the hour. I called the Edward Jones office on Marietta Street and reached Gerald Hinton, my grandmother's broker, who already knew about the IRS inquiry because Special Agent Kwan had contacted the firm directly, and who provided me with the full transaction history on the money market account and the CD without requiring further documentation because the IRS contact had already flagged the account for review. The transaction histories were not difficult to read. I am a compliance officer. I read transaction histories the way other people read sentences. For structure. For sequence. For the thing that does not belong in the pattern. What did not belong in the pattern was this, beginning 11 days after my grandmother's death and continuing across 14 months. 37. Withdrawals and transfers had been made from the three accounts at Citizens Trust Bank and the money market account at Edward Jones. The withdrawals ranged in size from $4,000 to $14,000. They were spaced irregularly, sometimes 2 in a week, sometimes none for 3 weeks, in the specific pattern that compliance officers recognize as the deliberate avoidance of reporting thresholds. Federal law, under the Bank Secrecy Act, requires financial institutions to file a currency transaction report for cash transactions exceeding $10,000, structuring transactions to avoid that threshold, keeping withdrawals below $10,000 to avoid the reporting requirement is itself a federal crime under 31 U.S.C. Set 5324, known as structuring. Regardless of whether the underlying funds are legitimately obtained, these withdrawals were not legitimately obtained, and they were structured. That double fact is what had drawn the attention of IRS criminal investigation. Every withdrawal had been authorized with my grandmother's signature, which was not my grandmother's signature, because my grandmother had been dead for 11 days when the first one was executed. Devin had access to the accounts through the key he had been given during his month of residence. He had, at some point, in the 12 hours he was alone in the house on Briarcliff Road, obtained the account, documentation, and the signature cards and whatever access credentials my grandmother had kept in the file cabinet. He had then spent 14 months making withdrawals in amounts calibrated to avoid reporting requirements, replacing the current statements in the file cabinet with prior year statements to prevent detection during the estate inventory, and filing a federal estate tax return that underreported the estate's assets by the exact amount he had taken. That last act, the filing of the federal estate tax return with falsified asset figures, is what distinguished the matter from a state-level property crime and brought it into federal jurisdiction. Filing a false federal tax return is a violation of 26 U.S.C. Sat 7206(1). Using forged signatures to access financial accounts constitutes bank fraud. Under 18 U.S.C. Sats 1344, the structuring of withdrawals to avoid reporting requirements violates 31 U.S.C. Sat T. 5324. Devin had committed 3 distinct federal offenses, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, which has a civil recovery rate that the agency publicly reports at above 90% of cases it pursues, had found them through the standard cross-referencing of institutional reporting against filed returns. Rachel Fortier met with Special Agent Kwan on Monday morning. I attended the meeting at the IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office on Spring Street in Atlanta, and I presented the transaction histories I had pulled from Citizens Trust and Edward Jones, the original estate inventory with the incorrect statement, dates identified and flagged, and a 9-page chronological memorandum I had written over the Thanksgiving weekend documenting every relevant event from my grandmother's death forward with dates, amounts, and sources. Special Agent Kwan looked at the memorandum and said, "You compiled this yourself." I told her I was a compliance officer and that this was how I processed things that needed to be processed. She said the memorandum was more organized than most of what she received from professional forensic accountants. Rachel Fortier said nothing, but I saw her expression from across the table, and I noted it. Devin was arrested on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks later. He was charged in the Northern District of Georgia with one count of filing a false federal tax return under 26 U.S.C. Section 7261, one count of bank fraud under 18 U.S.C. Set 1344, and one count of structuring financial transactions under 31 U.S.C. Set 5324. The charges were filed by the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia, which handles federal criminal matters across the Atlanta metropolitan area and whose press releases, as a matter of public record, are available at justice.gov. My parents did not know. I need to say this clearly, and I need to say it with the care it deserves, because the title of this account includes them, and they deserve the precision of an honest description rather than a convenient one. My parents did not know that Devin had taken $212,000 from my grandmother's accounts. What they knew, what I came to understand through the conversations that followed the arrest, which were among the hardest conversations I have had in my adult life, was something adjacent to knowledge, but distinct from it. They knew Devin had been struggling. They knew he had come into money in the 14 months after my grandmother's death because he had told them, when the evidence of it was visible, that he had done some freelance work that had paid well. They had not asked the questions that the answers would have required. Because my parents are people who have spent 37 years not asking Devin the questions whose answers would require action, and that practice had become, by the time it mattered most, indistinguishable from a policy. That is the harder accounting, and it is one that does not have a legal resolution. There is no charge filed for the willful avoidance of uncomfortable questions. There is no restitution order for the years of looking away from a pattern that was visible. What there is, in my family's case, is a set of conversations that I have been having with my parents since Devin's arrest. Not about what Devin did, which the federal court is addressing, but about the pattern that made what Devin did possible, and about the specific failure of the people who loved him most to insist that he be held responsible for himself before the consequences of not being held responsible became federal charges. Devin pleaded guilty. He entered a plea agreement with the United States Attorney's Office in which he admitted to all 3 counts and agreed to full restitution of the $212,000 plus interest to the estate. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta on McDonough Boulevard, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The restitution is being paid from a payment plan the court established through the federal payment portal at justice.gov, USAO, NDGA, at a rate that will take considerably longer than the supervised release period to complete, which is the predictable outcome of an agreement. Why? Someone whose financial history demonstrates a consistent inability to sustain effort over time. The estate was closed by Carolyn Bassett at Bassett and Horn after a process that took considerably longer than it should have, and that cost considerably more in legal fees than it should have, and that distributed to my mother and my uncle, Roderick, a sum that was smaller than what my grandmother had intended them to receive, because $212,000, even partially recovered through restitution, does not return to an estate whole. The restitution payments arrive monthly and are dispersed to the estate account at Regions Bank, and from there to my mother and Uncle Roderick, according to the proportions of the will, and I track them with the same monthly discipline. I applied every account I am responsible for because tracking is the thing that catches what concealment is counting on you not to do. I want to say something about the house on Briarcliff Road in Decatur because it is where this begins and because it deserves a place in the account that is not only the location of a crime. My grandmother lived in that house for 22 years. She grew fig trees in the backyard that are still there, and she made fig preserves every summer in ball-wide mouth mason jars. The 12-pack of pint jars available at Walmart for about $11, and she labeled every jar with the year in a black Sharpie marker and lined them on the pantry shelf in order. Oldest in front because that is how you use preserves. The house sold 18 months after her death, after the estate was closed. To a young couple with a child, the fig trees went with the house. I hope they know what to do with fig trees. My grandmother could have told them. I close with what is practical, because practical is what remains after the grief and the legal proceedings and the family conversations that do not resolve cleanly, and the fig preserves that are gone from the pantry shelf. If you are an executor of an estate named in a will, appointed by a court, trusted by someone who loved you with that specific and serious form of trust, pull the real-time account balances from the financial institutions directly. Do not rely on paper statements you find in a file cabinet. Call the bank and ask for the current balance as of today for every account on your inventory. This single step takes 20 minutes, and it is the step that closes the window that was left open on Briarcliff Road. Keep your grandmother's file cabinet. The Century 1170 fire-resistant model she owned is available at the Container Store in Home Depot for about $50, and it holds everything that matters. But verify what is inside it against what the institutions will tell you directly, because verification is what the people who love you are counting on you to do on their behalf. Do not love someone so much that you trust their filing system without checking it. And if your phone rings at Thanksgiving dinner with an unknown number from a federal area code, you pick it up, you push your chair back, you excuse yourself, and you take it in the hallway. Some calls are not calls. They are the record finally arriving,